welcome to another workshop of the Laboratory for Lacanian Politics. This year under the theme Bodies, Networks, Borders, the New Politics of the Not All. That's a title that we would like to live up to, shall we say. But it gives us a direction of travel. If you've seen the argument for the year's work, one of our initial references is the Jean-Claude Milner text, The Traps of the All, from his book, The Criminal Inclinations of Democratic Europe. This is a translation of the first two chapters, I think, of that book into English, done extremely well by Ed Plough, and available on the website of the Journal of Lacanian Ideology Critique, which goes under the letter S. So you can find the links to that on the website of the London Society, or you can track it down per se. But I'm going to try to indicate to you today why, to encourage you, let's say, to have a look at it and try to indicate some of the reasons why we might consider this text more carefully as providing a platform for various lines of work that we might pursue this year and in coming years. What I'm going to do today, we have 3 hours. We're going to have three 1-hour sequences. I'm going to present something brief on the Milner text. Isabel Miller is going to present something on an associated theme of Milner and
Baudrillard, actually.
And Bourdieu, and then in Baudrillard, and in the third hour, Janet Haney and Jason Glynis are going to open up a space for feeding back from the Brussels Forum on Discourses That Kill, just discussing some of the themes that arise from that, which we'll try to filter into the question of how we work in the laboratory, and also start opening up some lines of work towards the forthcoming forum of the Euro Federation of Psychoanalysis in Milan on the 14th of February, under the theme Love and Hate in Europe, or for Europe,
I think.
For Europe. So plenty to keep us occupied. I won't rehash, shall we say, either the ethics of the laboratory or the style of work that we're aiming to make room for. What I will say about the Milner text, which we might take as a common reference, is that it allows us to extract the bare bones of Lacan's logic of the all and the not all, and use it as a template for a reading of contemporary political questions. In particular, one of the advantages of Milner's distillation of Lacan's formula of sexuation is that he manages to align the logic of the all and the not all respectively as a logic of closed and unlimited wholes, with the articulation between the political and the social registers. If you've seen the argument for the year, hence the question of the relation between borders and networks, mapped onto limited and unlimited, open and closed sets. Just briefly, I'll say, in terms of the participative work that we'd like to encourage, what we're trying to do is elaborate some kind of discursive logic that will provide a framework for a psychoanalytic framework for taking on a reading of contemporary political questions, and at the same time make room for some kind of concrete empirical research in particular fields of interest in some of the pressing concerns all around us. We'll discuss that a bit later at the end of the day. So how many people know the Milner text? I'm going to open up the reading of this text with the hope that I can encourage you to go back and have a look at it if you read it before, or get hold of it if you haven't, with the idea that there's actually more to get out of this text going forward. Just briefly, in the introduction, Milner refers to an organon. The initial sentence of this text, an organon is needed. You may know that this is the traditional reference to Aristotle's work, but here he links the relation of Lacan to Aristotle by suggesting that we can find an organon of Lacan's work in his doctrine of wholes, in the plural, the doctrine of the all, too. Elaborated most obviously in Seminar 20, but also in the two previous seminars, Seminar 18 and Seminar 19, and in the Creed text, Lecture D. The first point that Milner makes is to highlight the ambiguity of this term, two wholes. This is an ambiguity, shall we say, that's compounded by the English translation of Seminar 20, where we have a slippage in the translation of this term as either whole with a W or all. Bruce Fink has chosen whole for the translation, but I find that makes it easier to lose many of the implications and the elaborations that might be pursued on the side of the logic of the all and the not all, where a logic of the whole and the not whole doesn't align entirely transparently with what a logic of the all and the not all might be. There are also some other questionable translation decisions just in relation to Seminar 20, which might be the most familiar point of entry for this zone of Lacan's work. Most obviously in relation to the translation of la femme as woman with a capital W. If one actually looks at this in relation to the original, it means that the translation is inevitably forced to garble a little bit Lacan's developments, specifically in the key chapter, chapter 6, God and the jouissance of the woman, where Lacan is making very specific points about the logical status of the definite article in French, la, the woman. Most obviously as derived from the logic of set theory, where, based on Milner's reading, we can see that the definite article constitutes a grammatical indicator of the constitution of a closed set. Hence, the grammatical distinction between the definite and the indefinite article in French, which doesn't carry through into the English, maps onto the constitution between two different kinds of set. So there's the definite article for the closed set. It's the grammatical indicator of the logic of a closed set. And there's the indefinite article, which opens onto the logic of the open set, which is a logic of the not all. So we might highlight the question of the ambiguity of translation in English between whole and all, because this marks the distinction between what we could call the anatomical, the physiological vocabulary of relation between parts and wholes, and the logical vocabulary of a relation between elements and sets, which is exactly the frontier that Lacan is working at that stage by introducing the logic of the not all. On the one hand, we have what we could call the traditional psychoanalytic vocabulary of the relation between parts and wholes, most obviously based on the image of the body, the organs as part of a constituted body, the Kleinian notion of part objects contained in the mother's body, from which we are familiar with Lacan's elaboration of the object petit a, initially derived not so much from the Kleinian part object as from Winnicott's elaboration of the notion of the transitional object, but ultimately working towards the notion of a part that is not related to any whole. We could then track the elaboration of the notion of object A in Lacan's work, initially derived from an organic reference to the body, not so much primarily as a constituted object, but more specifically in relation to a source of stimulation, its relation to an erotogenic zone, hence its relation to the orifices of the body. Just marking the difference between the focus on the object and the focus on the zone opens up the space where we can understand Lacan's ongoing logification of the status of object A, where eventually it's no longer related to the body. This would be one way of tracking the trajectory of seminar A, of object A between seminar 10 on anxiety and seminar 16, where he elaborates the notion of surplus jouissance, object plus jouir. All of that traces out, shall we say, the arc that goes from the whole of the body to the all of the logical set, from the part in relation to the whole of the body to the element in relation to the set, which we can then see is a fairly central trajectory of that central part of Lacan's work, which opens up between the question of the translation of tout as a whole with a W or as an all. That's one important framework of that question of the logic of the not all, but not one that should blind us to the more fundamental ambiguity that Milner highlights in modalities of the all. Once again, we can see Milner's linguistic formation helping us to locate the importance of the grammatical trace in the singular and plural forms of the all, indexed on the status of that definite or indefinite article. Something which I understand is not equivalent in the English and in the French. There's a more defined usage of the status of the article in French. If you were at Milner's recent presentation at the Kingston Summer School, you might remember his reading of Joyce de Saint-Ton, where he once again highlighted the status of this definite article, this minute word that we skip past, in separating out the space between la femme and l'homme, where on the one hand, l'homme to some extent fuses the article with the substantive to produce the writing l'homme, in contrast to Lacan's writing of la femme, where the la is barred to open up the open series of feminine sexuation. And right at that point, we could say, in the grammatical relation, in the status of the article between la femme and l'homme, we see the grammatical outline of the question of the sexual non-rapport at the level of grammar. We see it's not equivalence. I just touch on that in order to once again mark the threshold, shall we say, between the grammatical approach to these questions and the logical approach, which are not necessarily superimposed. Phil?
Can I ask how you're spelling long?
with 3 capital letters, L-O-N. All of this as a little bit of an elaboration, background, context to Milner's next claim at the start of our article, where he speaks about, he gives a description of Lacan's logic of the alls in the plural as establishing the ways in which a subject is inscribed as man or as woman with respect to the phallic function considered as a propositional function. I'll just highlight 3 aspects of that key proposition formula. One, the logic of the alls establishes the ways in which a subject is inscribed as man or as woman with respect to the phallic function considered as a propositional function. Very condensed, but we can extract 3 key elements of that formulation. The first is that it entails an operation of inscription. We can then bring into focus questions surrounding this operation of inscription. What is it? Where? How? By what means? We can see to some extent it entails an inscription on the body. At the same time, to some extent, an inscription in the other, in the social other. Although, if nothing else, what Lacan's elaboration of the question of writing has brought into focus is that inscription needs a surface of inscription. But between the question of inscription on the body and inscription in the other, if nothing else, the question of inscription brings into focus the relation between the body and the other. 2 different forms of inscription, 2 different modalities of inscription, or are we already in the part of Lacan's work where he's already formulated that the body is the other? I hope to be able to show you that all those questions are central to any exploration of the point of intersection between the clinical, the social, and the political fields, and hence would provide a central reference, a central zone of articulation for any attempt to extend the clinical discourse of psychoanalysis to some kind of operative reading in the political field. In the first instance, these questions are elaborated within the psychoanalytic clinic, precisely in relation to the clinic of sexuation. At that point, we can see that it's not so much a question of the articulation of the clinical discourse to the external field of politics, because if nothing else, the question of sexuation itself is increasingly a political question. To some extent, has always been a political question. As you know, questions of gender, questions of sexual orientation, the whole Freudian discourse as played out between the 2 axes of identification and object choice, the whole current thematic of identity politics, where it's difficult to ignore the fairly rapid reconfiguration currently going on, most obviously in the debate currently surrounding the issue of transgenderism, where we see the elaboration of let's call it a transgender discourse as a political discourse. I'll just say, on the one hand, it's not clear that the traditional Freudian axes of identification on one hand and object choice on the other hand are currently distinguished or being deployed in the same way as previously in Freud's time. It may be that gender identity is now primarily being asserted as a question of choice, the right to choose one's gender, affiliated with some of the medical and scientific advances. And yet it's difficult to ignore that the political discourse of transgenderism is to some extent a paradoxically conformist discourse, in that it maintains its reference to two poles, the masculine and the feminine, while asserting the right to transition between them. Whereas one would think that if nothing else, the other side of the question, of the problem, is the fact that those two poles themselves increasingly fail to hold up. I mention those questions only in passing. I don't think they'll be our primary point of reference today, but also because it's a dense and highly politicized field with a variety, let's say, of vested interests. And I don't think that's a question we should take on lightly until it can be clarified by a more rigorous application of Lacan's reading of the formulae of sexuation and the logic of the not all, which, if one takes the time to examine the question, the logical framework of the formula of sexuation, turns out to be a far more subtle, radical, and revolutionary reading of the question of sexual identity than a lot of gender studies give Lacan credit for, while appropriating his work for their own ends. That is a comment on the first aspect of Milner's third sentence, 20 paragraphs of Milner, on the question of inscription. There are two other aspects of that formulation. The logic of the alls in the plural establishes the ways in which a subject is inscribed as man or as woman with respect to the phallic function considered as a propositional function. I just want to then say something both about the question of the phallic function and about this notion of the propositional function, and obviously about the phallic function as a propositional function. We could say that those two phrases, those two components of that sentence, index one of Lacan's pivotal developments. On the one hand, his extraction of the phallic function, which, as you will be familiar, is a fairly central reference to the classic phase of Lacan's teaching, where his first entrance to the paradoxes of the field of sexuation. But second, the reduction of that question of the phallic function to a propositional logic, again, as part of that trajectory between physiology and logic, where he takes up the questions at stake in the Freudian assertion that anatomy is destiny, and gives a logical reworking of the question in the later seminars. Separating out the question of the phallic function as a propositional function helps us to locate the question of how that articulation is played out in Lacan's work from the phallic function to its reading as a propositional function, which we could map as a shorthand onto the distinction between early Lacan and late Lacan. If nothing else, it also helps us bring into focus the third phase of Lacan's work. If we speak broadly about the early Lacan, classic Lacan of the phallus and the paternal metaphor, then the later question of from the linguistic to the logical reading of the phallic function. It carves out a space for what we could call the third phase of the later Lacan, which is the move to the Borromean clinic, where, if you remember, the phallus is no longer a primary reference at all, neither as object nor as signifier, if anything, simply as an adjective, where the the only way the phallus features in the Borromean knot is under the notion of phallic jouissance, as one element at play in the Borromean knotting, where the phallus is reduced to an adjectival qualification of a mode of jouissance. For instance, that also helps us take a reference on let's call it the Joycean clinic, Lacan's reading of Joyce, who, as he says in Seminar 23, could rely neither on his father nor on the phallus, but was instead led to elaborate the centum as a point of knotting without either phallic or paternal reference, as the basis for Joyce's inscription in the social bond, precisely via the operation of writing. So we'll see that it's the Joycean clinic and the Borromean clinic that helps us line up elements from the first and second Lacanian clinic in terms of how we're going to put these to use in a political reading. We could then, to simplify, just sketch out 3 phases of the linguistic reading, the logical reading, and then the topological reading, in order to think, can we pursue 3 forms, 3 modalities of Lacanian politics aligned with those 3 modalities of the clinical teaching, not one of which is exclusive of the others. And I doubt whether we are going to get to grips with the diverse political questions of the day by thinking we're going to reduce this to one formula or one approach. All of that to sketch out, let's say, the framework of the internal trajectory of Lacan's clinical work, which Milner takes to some extent as given, as the context of, he takes as given in those first couple of sentences, as the context for Milner's step of extending this problematic into the political field. I quote him again from what is now the 4th sentence of this text. I will take the liberty of giving this an expanded use to objects other than the names man and woman, and to functions other than the phallic function. We could say that marks the key step that's at the root of everything that follows in this text, and everything that might be of interest for us in Milner's extension of the Lacanian clinical apparatus to a reading of the political field. Of course, there's room here for a critical assessment, both, shall we say, of the adequacy of Milner's reading of the Lacanian doctrine, in particularly the details of the logic of the formula of sexuation. And if necessary, let's say, the adequacy of his reading of particular political questions. That's allowed to make room for some of the questions that have been posed to Milner's reading of these questions, as far as I'm aware, by Badiou on one hand and Zizek at various times on the other. I would say that we might give Milner the benefit of the doubt and see what use a close reading of his work might be to us. If nothing else, in understanding Lacan's own work in these areas a bit more precisely. Either way, these are all, let's say, fundamental questions for our work in the laboratory for the notion of what a Lacanian politics would be, because some of these fundamental methodological questions turn around the validity of the question of trying to export clinical discourse into the political field. It's important to see where those questions are. I'm not going to address them now, in order to see how they are addressed within the field of psychoanalysis. But certainly not at the level of what we would think of as some kind of applied psychoanalysis. But these are questions that have been worked within the clinical field in the relation between clinical psychoanalysis applied to therapeutics and Jean-Claude Milner's elaboration, especially I think in the early 2000s, of the question of applied psychoanalysis to show there is no such thing as applied psychoanalysis. There's a psychoanalytic reading of the field of discourse, which, while I'm there, maps onto Freud's own approach to the question of group psychology, where it's not a question of the application of individual psychology to collective psychology, where he shows to some extent it's the same field, and if anything, the notion of individual psychology is a modality of collective psychology. We'll pursue those questions as they arise. In helping to situate the way Milner bridges this question, takes the step of extending in particular the logic of the formula of sexuation to the reading of the clinical field. We can see that that's a step already taken in these first few lines of the first paragraph, which is a paragraph that's not even numbered. It's paragraph 0. That step itself will actually only be taken up in paragraph 5, section 5. I'm calling them paragraphs, but and why it's worth returning to this text is to see that the crux, or the value of Milner's argument, is not carried out strictly in a straight line, step by step, despite his absolutely methodological rigor. But sometimes they're intervening elaborations where we lose track of what is the main line of the argument. In this case, the question of the social function, the function of inscription in the social bond, is posed in that initial paragraph, but only then taken up fully in its consequences in the 5th section, where Milner introduces the notion of sociality, which is to some extent the notion of a social function, in direct parallel with the notion of the phallic function, which is a parallel that itself serves to bring into focus the question of the relation between inscription in the phallic function and inscription in the social function. Is, for instance, inscription in the phallic function a necessary condition for inscription in the social function? Or might there be other modalities of inscription in the social function that could either do without inscription in the phallic function, or could even supplement or make up for failure of inscription in the phallic function, which the case of Joyce demonstrates. Lacan's reading of the case of Joyce demonstrates for us. Anyway, this is how Milner puts it at the beginning of paragraph 5. Every society can be thought as a function that assigns to each speaking being the property of belonging to the social body. Milner proposes to call this function sociality. I suspect for us it's more useful to make use of the term social function, not just because it helps keep in view the parallel between the notion of a social function and the notion of a phallic function, but also because it can then act as a reminder, a prompt of the reference to another function that we are already more familiar with in its relation to the phallic function, which of course is that of the paternal function. You see that this then gives us 3 functions, 3 operators of inscription in the social bond: the paternal function, the phallic function, and Milner's introduction of the notion of a social function. We can then begin to consider possible modes of articulation between those 3 functions. articulations, shall I say, that have already been elaborated within the clinic. If anything, you will be familiar with the relation between the paternal function and the phallic function as elaborated in Lacan's classical teaching, most particularly in relation to the clinical psychosis. To some extent, what else is the elaboration of the paternal metaphor? What else is the paternal metaphor? In the one hand, it's Lacan's linguistic formalization of Freud's Oedipus complex. To some extent, the Oedipus complex itself as a social function. At the same time, the paternal metaphor as a linguistic formalization is precisely the form of articulation, if you remember this slightly complex writing of it, there we go. It's the form of articulation that produces the phallic function on the basis of the incident of the name of the father. Although it's never been quite clear to me exactly how do you line up the terms to get from the assumption of one to the production of other. To some extent, you have to assume the name of the father in order to arrive at the phallic function. But either way, we can see that what the paternal metaphor does is it articulates the paternal function and the phallic function as two parts of the metaphor. Whether we can reduce that metaphor to the name of the father over the phallus, which to some extent is what it does, name of the father over minus phi, introducing the operation of castration, or even in the more elaborate schemas of the preliminary question of the reading of Schreber, where you have in schema R, as the zones of symbolic imaginary come apart, opening up the gulf of the real, you have on the one hand P0, the void of the paternal function, articulated with a phi 0, the void of the phallic function, to show that the two are articulated. In fact, I always find it useful to remember that the paternal metaphor is elaborated by Lacan precisely and primarily on the basis of its absence in psychosis. It's a deduction on the basis of the absence of the operation of the name of the father in psychosis. In fact, the name of the father itself is a deduction. Hence, the possibility of elaborating alternative modes of stabilization, delusional metaphor, other non-metaphorical modes of stabilization in psychosis, which bring the possibility of a paternal function and a phallic function into operation without necessarily depending on the articulation of the paternal metaphor. Ultimately, also opening room for the question of other forms of stabilization and inscription in the social bond that depend neither on the paternal function nor the phallic function, which is what the Borromean knot works out. Hence, in applying these questions of functional inscription in the social bond, extracted from the clinic of psychosis to the field of the political field and the social field, you can see that a reference to the later clinic of the Borromean knot and the Santon would be the most useful framework for exploration of some of the most pressing contemporary social and political questions, where neither the phallic institution nor the paternal institution serve as the primary reference for articulating the social bond, which is where the clinic of ordinary psychosis, on one hand, the elaboration of what would be entailed by a clinic of the social bond, which is at the same time a clinic of the Santon as the foundation for the social bond, and in the wake of the Lacanian and Millerian notion of ordinary psychosis, the clinic of insertion and disinsertion. So all of those questions around the contemporary clinic of psychosis, no longer based in a clinic of the paternal metaphor triggering and untriggering, but rather in a more Borromean notion of inscription, insertion and disinsertion, we already have a robust clinical vocabulary that we would want to apply to a reading of the clinical questions. All of which requires a little work, but I'm trying to indicate why it might be productive, if not intriguing, for us to make the effort to follow through some of these questions in the detail that they require. So, this notion of three different functions of inscription in the social bond: paternal function, phallic function, social function, all provide effects of inscription as well as effects of belonging to the social body. And somewhere that question of belonging in relation to the question of inscription might turn out to be a fairly central political question, even though it tends to be masked and dressed up with other more superficial political questions. But we can see that question of inscription in a social body would be a central reference for a Lacanian politics. You'll also see that this question of the conditions of inscription of the speaking being in the social bond itself poses all kinds of questions, not just about the constitution of the subject, as in the clinic of psychosis, it's the clinic per se, but also the question of inscription in a pre-existing social body, which in time we would like to explore, not just the questions of inscription, nor the questions of the constitution of the subject via the process of inscription in the other, but to some extent the question of the constitution of the social body per se, the constitution of the political and social other, which to some extent Lacan's work on the formula reduces to the question of operations of set theory. The logic of set theory, the relation between elements and collectives, and possible modalities of inclusion, exclusion, belonging of an element to a collective set, but also in terms of modalities of constitution of collectives, whether they be political collectives, social collectives, or let's say logical collectives, which is what the logic of the not all examines. How are different logical modalities of collectives established that allow different forms of participation and situation of different elements within those collectives. And if that isn't the key political question of our times, as if there was only one. I'm not going to go on much longer. The end is in sight. So, all of these questions could be indexed on, constructed around Milner's elaboration of the notion of the social function within the context of the distinction he makes between the political sphere and the social sphere, something that comes more clearly into focus in section 5 and then later on in this text. I'm not going I've tried to open up this question in the first instance to whet your appetite, to raise your interest in going to look at this text yourself. Also because I I would like to use a bit more sustained reading of this text to lay the groundwork within which we can take up political, particular lines of research, more focused political questions, and even more focused empirical investigation of different areas, because I suspect this provides the most robust theoretical framework for organizing how we negotiate our way through the various political questions that we're confronted with. I would also then like to propose it as, shall we say, as a broad framework for our work this year within the laboratory, which we can situate on those two thresholds that I mentioned at the beginning, between, on the one hand, the elaboration of a vocabulary, some kind of theoretical apparatus that would make use of the psychoanalytical references to set up a framework for reading particularly political questions. And also for our choice, let's say, of test cases that we might want to examine more closely within the political or social field, to take up particular themes or questions and consider the ways we might pursue them. That's something we're going to discuss at the end of the day in terms of people's various interests in pursuing some of the more concrete empirical questions available to us. But if nothing else, it's designed to open up a field of research rather than to restrict it or to determine it, because I would like our trajectory of work for the year to be shaped as much by particular themes of investigation that we come up with, to some extent the most pressing concern forced on us by events, but also, as I said, by areas of research that each one of you might have an interest in pursuing, either alone or in small working groups like cartels. I have my own idea of some particular lines that we might pursue, but I think it's going to be more interesting to hear from you on possible lines of research. There's just one last thing that I wanted to say about the theoretical framework, because there's certainly a couple of even as we run these seminars, it would be nice to work on the question between the pursuing of the psychoanalytic references and the pursuing of the more concrete political references, and to see how we manage with the overlap and the interrelation between them. In terms of the elaboration of the psychoanalytic references, there are some very basic and very detailed steps that we could try to keep in play in order not to get too lost in the proliferation of political questions that we might take up or might be pressed upon us. The most basic for me for the work that we need to do now is this Milner text and Milner's work more broadly. How he sets up this question of the articulation between the logic of masculine and feminine sexuation, closed holes and open holes, the all and the not all, is obviously not exclusive to Milner. Not only is it something that he takes out of his reading of Lacan, but it's something that draws fairly heavily on Jean-Claude Milner's reading of Lacan, precisely where the two key Millerian references that we might consider going to next would be the two Milanese intuitions, where Milner himself, over two separate installments with multiple steps, takes up the question of psychoanalysis in an era of globalization, where he shows us very clearly how globalization to some extent is the opening up of the era of the not all, and shows not only how the psychoanalytic clinic has had to reorganize its internal clinical coordinates in entering the era of globalization, but how those coordinates then help us read social and political questions arising out of, to some extent, the modulation of traditional social and political groupings organized around closed holes under the logic of masculine sexuation, when that logic tends to dissolve into the logic of the not all and operators of masculine sexuation, like the name of the father, the paternal metaphor, the phallic reference, and all the institutional references of the logic of masculine sexuation very rapidly start to lose their traction, which is something encountered first of all within the psychoanalytic clinic, because it's been, and to some extent there again, we see Lacan's logical prescience in terms of, to some extent, the trajectory of Lacan's work from early, middle to late Lacan within the elaboration of the Lacanian clinic, and most of all, the theory of the past, different modalities of the theories of the ending of the psychoanalytic process, turn out to map within the 30 years of Lacan's teaching the trajectory that we, as a whole, as society, as political, and as psychoanalysts, have found ourselves pursuing willy-nilly, whether we liked it or not, whether we knew it or not, and we find ourselves, in a funny way, making use of Lacan's foresight, following following a precise psychoanalytic logic, which turns out to be the most prescient reference that any of us have for situating ourselves within contemporary discourses. That was returning to Miller's work, the two Milanese intuitions, because if anyone has taught us to read Lacan's Miller, I suspect that after some work on the logic of the not all as elaborated by Milner, returning to a reading of the Milanese intuition will open up, to some extent, the logical framework that Milner relies on and takes as given while exploring the questions. I suspect it will bring a number of things to light there. It also allows us to open up a condensed trajectory in some key Millerian references, not just the Milanese intuitions from 2002, but the Turin theory from 2 years previously, 2000, and the text A Fantasy from 2 years later than that, 2004. And if we wanted to take the Millerian references seriously, that little trajectory mapped by Miller in the course of 4 years, 2000, Turin theory of the school, where we see the internal politics of the Lacanian school as the template for any kind of psychoanalytic politics. The Milanese intuitions, where his reading of the political and social field in terms of a logic of globalization and the not all, to the presentation in Brazil in 2004, A Fantasy, where he does the reworking of the contemporary discourse to show not just how the discourse of the contemporary master has modulated, but how the discourse of analysis has reconfigured itself around that. That's a little bit of work that could keep us busy for a while too. It also points the way, final point, to Miller's paper on the speaking body and his elaboration of the question of the body event in the years 2014 to 2016, taken up most of all by Eric Laurent in his text, The Inverse of Biopolitics. And if we're trying to get anywhere, it would be to an integrated reading of how Eric Laurent has integrated and elaborated not just Laurent's reading of Miller, but this question of what a clinic of the Santon, a Borromean clinic of the Santon, linked to a politics of the body event would be, which to some extent turns out to be a politics of jouissance. I'll leave that there for the moment to make room for any questions, and we'll have more time for discussion in the third.